There is arguably no better feeling in fantasy football than when you land an absolute steal in your fantasy football draft. Maximizing value and getting a guy that should have been drafted several rounds ago, that is the best possible way to get the leg up on your competition before that first football is even kicked in week 1. But who are the steals in 2024 fantasy football drafts? I got you, my friend. Today, in episode 34, the Giannis Antetokounmpo episode of Inside the 20, let's talk about players that are being drafted several rounds too late in Sleeper, ESPN, and Yahoo drafts. If you have an upcoming draft on any of those platforms, or even if you don't, I promise you, you do not want to miss this one. So the other day, I'm hanging out in my fantasy football Discord server with 181 other fantasy football players just talking ball, talking strategy, and the one and only Tanner Dawson, who is not just a BBFF subscriber, but he is the editor, he is the producer, he is the wizard behind the scenes of Inside the 20. He's the one making the show look and sound as awesome as it is. I'm just the guy who turns on the camera and starts recording about fantasy football data that I've found over the last couple hours. But in that Discord server, as we're hanging out, Tanner says, I got to figure out a way to take the Basement Brewed Fantasy Football Draft Guide, my rankings, and cross-reference that and compare that to Yahoo's average draft position and ADP. And that got us thinking in the Discord server, got us wondering, if we look at Yahoo, if we look at Sleeper, if we look at ESPN, which players in that pool, in that database, which players tend to be drafted way too low on those websites, thereby making massive draft day steals for people who are drafting on Yahoo, drafting on Sleeper, drafting on ESPN. So that's what I did. I went ahead and answered that question. What I did was I meticulously combed through Sleeper's ADP, the first 250 players in Sleeper's average draft position, identifying players that looked like they're being drafted way, way too low. And then I did the same thing for ESPN. And I did the same thing for Yahoo. And eventually, all of this came together in a worksheet that is now available to my subscribers in the Discord server. And to make sure that I did it from an unbiased point of view, right? It wasn't just me looking through a list of players and saying, oh, I like that player, he should be drafted higher. No. Instead of doing that, you know me, I'm all about data. I'm all about bringing information to the table and using data to make decisions. So instead of using my heart and my own brain to pick out which players should make the list, what I did was I cross-referenced each platform's average draft position. So I took Sleeper's, I took Yahoo's, and I took ESPN's, and I matched that average draft position, that ADP, up with the average draft position, the ADP of Underdog. Now, the reason I chose Underdog is because it is a very, very competitive platform. Some of the best fantasy football players in the world are doing best ball drafts and doing fantasy football drafts on Underdog every single day since February. It's a very, very competitive platform. It's widely known to be very sharp when it comes to drafting. There's a lot of quote-unquote sharks that are swimming in those waters. So theoretically, if we're taking an average draft position, an ADP data set that is theoretically created by a bunch of really sharp fantasy football players, and we cross-reference that with websites that tend to be a little bit more casual, although I hate that term, but a little bit more casual, like a Sleeper, an ESPN, or a Yahoo, suddenly we're going to see some discrepancies between the average draft position and boy, did we ever find some massive gaps, some massive discrepancies between where players are drafted on sharp websites like Underdog versus casual websites like Sleeper, ESPN, and Yahoo. For example, when I pop up the list right here, the first name I see is Josh Palmer at the very, very top. Now, Josh Palmer is a wide receiver for the Los Angeles Chargers, and there's a lot of question marks about who's going to be the wide receiver 1, who's going to be the wide receiver 2, and it very well could be their rookie, Ladd McConkey, but it also could be Josh Palmer, who's the longest tenured Charger with the team. It's very possible that by the end of the year, Josh Palmer ends up being the team's wide receiver 1. On Underdog, which again, that's where a lot of sharp fantasy football players play and where they've been doing drafts for months now, Josh Palmer usually gets drafted around pick 102 overall. Okay, so we're talking about 9th round-ish type of value. But on ESPN, the very same player, Josh Palmer, gets drafted around pick 167. That is a 65 pick difference between ESPN and Underdog. That's about a 5-6 round difference when you're considering Josh Palmer in Underdog versus where you're considering him on a more casual site like in ESPN. So that's the idea. That's the idea of today's conversation. We're going to talk about some of the names that popped up on all 3 lists, on ESPN's list, Sleeper's list, and Yahoo's list. Meaning, the whole point of this episode is that the general public, in general, is much, much, much too low on these guys, and they might come at a very nice discount for you in your league if you play on one of those platforms, or frankly, even if you don't. If you want access to the full list, there is a gigantic list on Yahoo, there's a gigantic list for Sleeper, and there's a gigantic list for ESPN. If you want access to that full list, simply A, join our Fantasy Football Discord server, or B, just send me an email using the link that we left for you in the show notes below, and I'll be glad to share it with you for free. We have our Discord server, which is an online community, it's an online army of 175 plus other fantasy football players helping each other dominate the fantasy football season. It's also where I spend 100% of my time hanging out 24/7, 365. It's where I share exclusive insights, golden fantasy football nuggets, the very, very second I find them. So if you want to come hang out with me, come hang out with us, all you got to do is go over to Basement Brood Fantasy Football's Patreon channel, which will leave a link for you in the show notes below. For free. All right, now, before we dive headfirst into this list of players, just a couple really quick things to keep in mind. And it might seem obvious, it might seem like it's common sense, but still, it's something that needs to be said. Number one, keep your own league in mind. Keep your scoring in mind, keep your settings in mind. If it's an 8-team league, a 16-team league, PPR, Superflex, whatever, all of those variables matter. All we're talking about today are players that, generally speaking, are undervalued by the fantasy football community as a whole. Number two, in addition to considering your own league, consider your competition, consider your league mates. Are you playing with people that are super fans of certain teams? For example, I was just speaking with a BBFF subscriber in our Discord server recently about somebody in their league who's both a Kansas City Chiefs and a Texas Longhorns fan, joking that they're gonna draft Xavier Worthy with the first overall pick. Of course, they're not, or they shouldn't. But point is, keep your league mates in mind. Fandom does some crazy things to people's mind when they're playing fantasy football. Keep in mind whether or not they tend to be a sharp fantasy football player, or whether or not they're just somebody who's a little bit more casual and maybe prints out a set of rankings the day before they walk into a draft. Keep all of these things in mind as we're going through this list. This list is merely meant to help you identify players that tend to be undervalued by the general fantasy football population. In other words, if you're looking for players that you can look back on in 6 months when the season is over and say, wow, what a steal that guy was in my draft, this is that list. Let's start out with a group of wide receivers that offer second round value and yet are being drafted as late as the 3rd, 4th, and even 5th round on ESPN, Sleeper, and Yahoo. And again, when I say second round value, that's not my opinion. Although it is, I agree that this is a second round value, but this is not my opinion. This is not a biased take. This is where these guys are drafted on competitive fantasy football websites such as Underdog. The first name on this list is Cooper Kupp. Now, on ESPN, Yahoo, Sleeper, those leagues, Cooper Kupp is being drafted around picks 33, 39, and 46 overall. If you're in a 12-team league, that means we're talking about Cooper Kupp being drafted in the 3rd or 4th round. We're talking about a guy who's averaging nearly 23 PPR points per game in games that he's played with Matthew Stafford as his quarterback, and that includes, by the way, averaging nearly 16 PPR points per game in games that he's played with Puka Nacua. I've talked all about Cooper Kupp. I talked all about Puka Nacua. I talked all about the Rams in episode 27. If you want more details on that, just feel free to head over there. But we're talking about a guy who is currently being drafted around pick number 22 overall, which is a second round pick on sharp websites like Underdog, which, by the way, Underdog is a half PPR website. It's not a full point PPR. So theoretically, guys like Cooper Kupp who rack up catches should be a little bit devalued on a website like Underdog. And yet Cooper Kupp is being drafted 24 picks ahead of where he's being drafted on some of these other casual sites where he's drafted around pick 46 overall. So you're taking a second round value and scooping him up in the third or fourth round. That's a massive victory in your fantasy football draft if you can land Cooper Kupp in the third or fourth round. Are you a software wizard? A code ninja? A forge master? Or maybe even just a mad scientist? Then come build your career ladder with Infinity Labs, an award-winning technology company, best place to work, and business of the year with best-in-class benefits and compensation. Visit i-labs.tech. That's i-labs.tech today, where you can learn more about Infinity Labs, our expanding national presence, and why the status quo has no hold on us. And by the way, if you are looking for a biased take on Cooper Kupp, I have the guy as high as 13th overall in my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, my 2024 fantasy football rankings. I'm very, very high on Cooper Kupp. And again, you can always reference episode 27 for reasons why, or you can just scoop up the draft guide. It's only $14.99, and we left a link for you in the show notes. Next up on this list is Mr. Deebo Samuel, who on ESPN, on Yahoo, on Sleeper, Deebo is being drafted around picks 29, 33, and 45 overall. Now, we're talking about a guy who's averaging 16 plus PPR points per game in contests that he's played with Brock Purdy, and that includes a massive potential ceiling of 22 plus PPR points per game if Brandon Ayuk is not in the picture, which very well could be the case come week 1, even though it's just a few days away at this point. But again, I've talked in depth about the 49ers. I've talked in depth about Deebo Samuel. That's over in episode 28 if you want more details. But we're talking about a guy who, on Underdog, which is where the Sharks are swimming, Deebo Samuel is currently being drafted around pick 17 overall. So we're talking high to mid-round, second-round pick on Underdog, a half PPR website, as opposed to picks 29, 33, 45. We're taking a guy who's usually drafted within the top 17 picks of a Sharp website, and now he's available in the third and even fourth rounds of some of the more casual websites like Yahoo, Sleeper, and ESPN. And by the way, if you're wondering where Deebo Samuel lands in my draft guide, in my rankings, apparently I'm right on par with Underdog's ADP, because I have Deebo Samuel ranked 17th overall, and Deebo's being drafted 17th overall over on Underdog. And then we got Jaylen Waddle. Now here's a guy who's being drafted on Yahoo, ESPN, and Sleeper around picks 36, 41, and even 52 overall. Now this is a guy who's averaging over 15 PPR points per game over 26 full contests that he's played with Tua Tagovailoa since Mike McDaniel became the team's head coach back in 2022. And again, I already talked about the Dolphins, I talked about Jaylen Waddle, I talked about all these guys. That was back in episode 21. But we're talking about a guy who's currently being drafted anywhere between picks 36 and 52. So we're talking third, fourth, and even fifth round in some cases. And yet on Underdog, Jaylen Waddle is currently being drafted around pick number 20 overall, which is a second-round pick. He's number 21 in my draft guide. Once again, a massive value in fantasy football drafts. You could get up to a 3-round discount on Jaylen Waddle if you're playing on ESPN, Yahoo, or Sleeper. And arguably the biggest value among this batch, this segment, this group of players is the flashy rookie Malik Nabers. Now, you can say what you want about the Giants' offense. You can say what you want about Daniel Jones. You can say what you want about the quality of the targets that Malik Nabers is going to see in 2024, but there's not much you can do to argue the quantity of the targets that Malik Nabers is going to see in 2024. There's no Darren Waller. There's no Saquon Barkley. There's no second option in the entire New York Giants offense. Say what you will about the quality of the targets that Malik Nabers is going to get, but he should get all of the volume that he can possibly handle, and volume is what wins in fantasy football. And now you're talking about a guy being drafted in the 4th, 5th, and sometimes even 6th round on Yahoo, ESPN, and Sleeper, whereas on Underdog, which again is where the Sharks are swimming, Malik Nabers is being drafted around pick 24 overall, which is right at the end of the second round. I have him as number 25 overall in my draft guide and in my rankings. We're talking about a 2, sometimes even 3 round discount on the flashy rookie Malik Nabers. Now, if you want to talk about maximizing your upside and swinging for the fences in your fantasy football draft, if you were to land a stud running back in rounds 1 and or even round 2 of your fantasy football draft, and then walk out of rounds 3 to 5 with Kupp and or Deebo Samuel and or Jaylen Waddle and or Malik Nabers and or Devontae Smith, who we didn't even mention, but he's on this list, you've already won. You've already dominated your fantasy football draft. You're off to a terrific, terrific start if that's the way it shakes out in your drafts on Yahoo, ESPN, or Sleeper. And even if that's not the way it shakes out in your fantasy football drafts, don't panic, because now we're going to talk about some wide receivers that offer 4th and 5th round value that, once again, you can get at a multi-round discount in your 2024 fantasy football drafts. Basement Brood Fantasy Football subscribers, they are using my weekly heat map. This is a resource that I put together every single week for my subscribers that offers contextual analysis for every single player in every single game, every single week, to help you conquer the most impossible start-sit decisions and dominate the week. Now, over on the left side of the heat map, you're going to see all the team and game information for every team in every game that week. You're going to have their over-unders, which are color-coded, green for high-scoring games and red for low-scoring games, to give you an idea of which games are going to feature plenty of touchdowns and which games won't. Which games will be defensive slugfests that really don't offer a ton of fantasy football points. You're going to see the spread, which again is color-coded in green to show you which teams are favored to win, and red to show you which teams are expected to lose and possibly lose by a lot. So in this case, Packers 49ers, the Packers were 10-point underdogs in that game, which means we can expect the Packers to be trailing in the second half, likely throwing the ball as much as they possibly can in an effort to keep up with the San Francisco 49ers. Meanwhile, the 49ers being 10-point home favorites, they're likely to be running the ball plenty in the second half as they try and kill the clock and move on to the next week. It's going to show you each team's implied point total for that week. Again, color-coded in green to show you the highest scoring teams that week, the projected highest scoring teams. And it's going to show you the red, which is the projected low scoring teams of that week. So in other words, if the 49ers are expected to score over 30 points in that week, you know there's going to be fantasy football points galore. You typically want to get the 49ers into your lineup. Whereas if the Texans are expected to score just 17 points in their game, that might be a week where you consider keeping some of your Texans on the bench. Last but not least, underneath the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end columns, you're going to see a color-coded number that reflects that team's defense and how they perform against that position. So for example, next to the Ravens, underneath quarterback, you're going to see the number 30, which means they are holding enemy quarterbacks to the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game. Quarterbacks are scoring the 30th most fantasy points per game against the Ravens. Meanwhile, the Texans, if you look under the tight end column, you'll see a number 3 for them in this example, meaning the Texans are allowing the 3rd most PPR points per game to opposing tight ends. It's a quick and easy cheat sheet. It's a quick and easy reference guide to help you understand which defenses are strong or weak against which positions. And then over on the right side of the heat map, every single player in every game that week is listed in one of 5 columns. They are either in column A, the blue column, which is a column where all of the data suggests a monster explosion week is coming for that player, or they're placed in column B, the green column, which suggests all the data is pretty good. We should expect an above average performance from that player in their upcoming game. Or they're placed in the C column, the yellow column, which is exactly what it's labeled. Meh. There's nothing that's particularly exciting or nothing that's particularly daunting about the data and the projection for that player's matchup in that week. And then there's the column D column, the orange column, which is where they feel gross. This is a column where all of the data suggests, you know what, this game might be a little bit of a struggle for that player. If there's a week to keep him on the bench, this might be the one. And of course, the last remaining column, the F column, which you can read what it's titled, the red column. These are players that you quite literally shouldn't even be considering for your lineup. I do this for every single player in every single game, every single week. So during the season, when there's 16 games in a week, there are over 250 players in these columns. And when you're faced with these difficult decisions, like trying to decide between David Montgomery or Najee Harris for that RB2 spot, all you have to do is click on any player's name in the heat map or press enter on it. And just like you saw in the draft guide, it's going to tell you what to expect from that player in that game. So in our example, current example, where every week we're probably going to be trying to decide between David Montgomery and Najee Harris, all you would do when faced with those impossible dilemmas is come into the heat map, find that player, click on their name, read the analysis, and make your decision. So in this case, Najee Harris isn't even in this example of the heat map because I grabbed last year's divisional round as my sample. The Steelers weren't in the divisional round, they didn't play, but the Lions did. So you would look at Najee Harris and then you would come look at David Montgomery. He was in the yellow column for this particular game, the meh column. And when you click open his name, it's going to tell you two things. It's going to tell you A, what to expect from the Detroit Lions offense in that game. How does the game set up for them? Are they expected to win, lose, score a lot, score a little, win by a lot, lose by a lot? What to expect from the Detroit Lions offense and how volume might shake out for their players. Then, as you scroll down, you're going to see what to expect from David Montgomery. It's going to tell you how David Montgomery has been trending during a specific period of time. Is he on the verge of overtaking Jahmyr Gibbs as the team's RB1? Is he on the verge of falling further and further behind Jahmyr Gibbs? Is he losing playing time? Keep scrolling down. It's going to tell you how his opponent is performing against running backs. In this case, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. How have they been performing against other teams' running backs? How, in which direction have they been trending? And most importantly, how are the Buccaneers performing against running backs that are similar to David Montgomery, including David Montgomery himself? Again, this is the resource that started this entire business after it went somewhat viral on Reddit. This is a resource that 300 plus BBFF subscribers are referencing every single week when they're trying to conquer those impossible start-sit dilemmas, when they're setting their DFS lineups, and frankly, when they're looking for appetizing prop bets to take advantage of during the week and during the season. Again, you can gain access to every single heat map that I do this year. I do it from week 1 all the way through the Super Bowl, excluding week 18 and of course the Pro Bowl. But you can gain access using the link that we left for you in the show notes, which is going to take you right over to Basement Brood Fantasy Football's Patreon. Further and further and further we get down this list, the bigger and bigger and bigger the gap gets between where players are drafted on casual sites like ESPN, Yahoo, and Sleeper compared to sharper websites such as Underdog. Case in point, let's talk about Rashee Rice. Now, on ESPN, Yahoo, and Sleeper, Rashee Rice is currently being drafted around picks 70, 85, and 87 overall. So we're talking about 6th, 7th, and sometimes even 8th round of 12-team PPR leagues. We're talking about a guy who averaged nearly 18 PPR points per game over his last 9 games during his rookie season with Patrick Mahomes. And yes, there is a potential suspension looming, but as of right now, with how late we're getting in the offseason, all signs seemingly are pointing to that suspension not hitting until 2025, a lot like Alvin Kamara from a couple years back. So we're taking a guy who averaged nearly 18 PPR points per game. He's the new wide receiver 1 for Patrick Mahomes, who we know is a prolific quarterback. It's a prolific offense. And this guy's going in the 6th, 7th, and sometimes even 8th round of ESPN, Sleeper, and Yahoo drafts, compared to going about 43 overall on Underdog. He's going in the 4th round of drafts on Underdog. We're talking about a 2, 3, or sometimes even 4 round discount on Rashee Rice. This is a guy who's ranked 35th overall in my fantasy football draft guide. Massive, massive discount for a difference-making wide receiver. And then we got Christian Kirk. Now, Christian Kirk is a guy who, on ESPN, Yahoo, and Sleeper, he's being drafted around picks 67, 84, and 98 overall. Okay, so we're talking rounds 6, 7, 8, sometimes even round 9 in a 12-team league for Christian Kirk. We're talking about a guy who, in the 2 years that he's been with Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars, he's averaging 14 PPR points and nearly 8 targets per game over 28 full contests with Trevor Lawrence. And now he's being drafted in the 6th, 7th, 8th, and sometimes even 9th round on ESPN, Sleeper, and Yahoo, compared to 53 overall on sharp websites like Underdog, which again, I'm reminding you, Underdog is a half PPR point type of website, which is usually where Christian Kirk butters his bread, and yet he's still being drafted about 4 rounds higher on Underdog than he is on Yahoo, ESPN, and Sleeper. Massive discount. Again, I have Christian Kirk ranked number 53 in my draft guide and in my rankings, and I talked ad nauseum about Christian Kirk and the Jaguars offense in episode 24 if you want more detail on Christian Kirk or the Jaguars. All right, let's talk about a guy who was already one of my favorites in 2024 fantasy football, even on competitive sites like Underdog and like Drafters. We're talking about T. Higgins. My mouth dropped when I saw the ADP for T. Higgins on Sleeper, Yahoo, and ESPN. This is a guy who, on those websites, is being drafted anywhere between picks 60 and 68, okay? So he's being drafted in about the 5th or 6th round of 12-team PPR leagues. We're talking about a guy who is averaging 15 PPR points, 8 targets per game in 28 full contests that he's played with Joe Burrow and with Jamar Chase. In episode 25, I talked about T. Higgins' massive, explosive ceiling should anything ever happen to Jamar Chase, who, by the way, has been holding out for a contract extension over the last few weeks as well. And we're talking about a guy who, on Underdog, on Drafters, he's being drafted in the 4th round, and I was more than happy to spend a draft pick on him in the 4th round. And then you take ESPN and Yahoo and Sleeper, and you can get him in the 5th and sometimes even 6th round. That's how you dominate a fantasy football draft. Next up on the list is Mr. Scary Terry McLaurin, who on ESPN, on Yahoo, on Sleeper, this is a guy that's being drafted around picks 69, nice, 78, and 88 overall, okay? So in a 12-team league, Mr. McLaurin is usually going in rounds 6, 7, sometimes even 8. Now, when you think about what I was talking about with Malik Nabers, it's the same story for Terry McLaurin. The Washington Commanders were an offense that was already pretty void of standout pass-catching options even before they traded Jahan Dotson. Now you have Terry McLaurin, who's the clear wide receiver 1, light years and tiers ahead of everybody else on the Washington Commanders roster and on their depth chart. Competing, quote-unquote, competing with Terry McLaurin for targets will be 3rd-round rookie Luke McCaffrey, who, by the way, is basically brand new to playing wide receiver. It's a very new position for him. You got 2021 3rd-rounder Diami Brown, who's done very little with his career up to this point. You got soon-to-be 34-year-old Zach Ertz, who, by the way, is coming off of an injury. Competing with him is a 22-year-old rookie tight end in Ben Sennett, who, of course, is no guarantee to play ahead of Zach Ertz or run more routes or get more targets. Terry McLaurin very well could be a one-man show. He should vacuum and hog as many targets as he can possibly stomach in that Washington Commanders offense, catching passes from Jaden Daniels. And now you got a guy who's being drafted in the 6th, 7th, and sometimes even 8th round of a 12-team fantasy football league, despite being drafted around pick 50 overall on sharp websites like Underdog. That is an early 5th-round pick. I have Terry McLaurin as high as 39 overall in my rankings and in my draft guide. There's a big value on Terry McLaurin. Honestly, I could go on and on and on about wide receivers, a couple running backs, guys that are massive value picks if you're drafting on Yahoo, Sleeper, and ESPN. Heck, there's some really, really high upside wide receivers like Christian Watson, for example, who comes at a 4, sometimes even 5 round discount when comparing him on Underdog versus where you get him on Sleeper, Yahoo, and ESPN. Again, this list of draft day steals has nearly 150 names on it. 50 names per platform. There's 50 names for Sleeper, 50 names for Yahoo, 50 names for ESPN. If you'd like to get access to this list, there are two really easy ways to get it. Number one, just send me an email. We left a link for you in the show notes. Just send me an email, let me know you want it, and I'll send it your way. Number two, and the better option, join Basement Brood Fantasy Football's Discord server. Join my Discord server. BBFF's online community and Discord server that's filled with sharp fantasy football brains and NFL fans that are dedicated to helping each other outsmart their friends, dominate their leagues, cash in on NFL bets, and take down DFS contests. You can join us while the cost is less than one beer per month using the link that we left for you in the show notes. It's an online community. It's an online army of 181 other fantasy football players helping each other dominate. It's also where your boy, it's also where I'm hanging out 24/7, 365, talking ball, talking players, talking strategy. It's where I'm sharing exclusive insights and spreadsheets just like this one the very second I find them and the very second that I create them. Again, you can join our fantasy football Discord server. You can join our online community, our family, our army, whatever you want to call it, using the link that we left for you in the show notes. That's going to be all for today's episode. Hopefully you found this helpful. Hopefully this is going to help you go out and absolutely crush your fantasy football drafts this weekend. I know Labor Day weekend tends to be the busiest fantasy football draft weekend of the entire year. So use this knowledge to dominate those drafts and get ahead of your competition on the fantasy football field. Now, the next time you hear from me, the first football will have already been kicked. We got Chiefs, Ravens coming up to kick off the 2024-2025 NFL season. And Inside the 20, the show that you're listening to, the show that you're watching right now, we are going to move this show from Fridays to Saturdays. And on Saturdays, we are going to preview the upcoming week of fantasy football. Why? Because from Tuesday through Thursday, every single week, I'm going to be heads down in the basement working on this, the lineup setting heat map. Now, this is the tool that started this entire business after it exploded on Reddit. This is a resource that all 300 plus of my subscribers use when they're conquering even the most impossible of start-sit decisions so that they can set league-wrecking lineups every single week. The heat map is a tool that offers contextual analysis for every single player in every single game. So anybody that you're considering for your lineup, simply double click on their name or click enter on their name, and you're going to see a full, thorough breakdown of what to expect from that player in that game, so you can answer the question of whether or not you want this player in your lineup or if this is a week that they should ride the bench. If you'd like to learn more about the weekly heat map or perhaps order your own for the 2024 season, you guessed it, we left a link for you in the show notes. That's going to be all for today's conversation. I hope you found this helpful. I will see you on the fantasy football field next Saturday for a preview of Week 1 fantasy football. Cheers. This brew's for you.